I'm no Peter Pan, and this ain't Neverland, but still look out for Tinkerbell, trying to stutter your spell. We're back with more Wilds of Eldraine Standard.
It only matters if it ladders. Comment below with your thoughts as we navigate through Week 2's metagame shifts. Now let's untap. Alrighty. Tier 1 this week showed Golgari holding true to form and putting up some dominant numbers, while Mono Red also maintained. The rise of Esper Legends, or Esper Rafine, however you want to label this deck, from Tier 2 to Tier 1 was a bit surprising for me, but I never hate seeing Rafine do some damage. And last but not least, Naya tokens fell off a cliff as we predicted. Max, what do we have for Tier 2?
So for Tier 2, this is where Domain landed. Both versions of it, from the looks of things, really. Orzhov tokens didn't last too long, but then there's the return of Orzhov midrange with some updates that took its place. Similarly, Dimir Aggro hasn't really made a strong showing, but Dimir Fae has sort of replaced it for now. Darth Rictus, what can we expect over in the Brewer's Corner?
This week in New Brews, we have a spicy Boros aggro list out of Japan, a Rock Reanimator list that seeks to go over the mid-range meta, a Grixis mid-range build featuring 4 copies of Decadent Dragon, and last but not least, I want to give a shout-out to @LucasCastro-OC8TT for sharing their Isit Spells deck up in response to last week's State of the Meta. To everyone else, feel free to drop some spicy brews in the comments thread and talk shop with us. We absolutely love it. Now let's get down to the Tier 1 breakdowns, starting with Golgari Aggro.
Let's go.
The Rock is as sturdy as its namesake. Let's just tally this weekend's results in tournaments. First place in the Pizza Box, 128-man online tourney. Second and third place in the MTG Japan Open, a highly reputed and widely attended tournament. And second place in an MTGO challenge as well. Now that is a lot of data, all with similar deck lists showcasing the strength of this deck moving forward. Now, I do need to eat a little bit of crow publicly for not believing in the turtle. Ye old Blossoming Tortoise, featured right here, this little guy right here, was in every single top 8. So, I was wrong, much as I hate to say it. This card is the real deal, and while it doesn't have the raw power of Shieldred, it does tie the archetype together nicely by being another must-kill creature while ramping you into your late game and making your creature lands a huge problem. This archetype is here to stay, folks, so you best be ready to grind it out. Dimir is dead. Long live the king. Long live Lord Skitter.
Ooh. Oh, man. Speaking of, what does this deck have in store for Dimir midrange? Now, we know Dimir to be a deck that's all about these tied advantages, especially when it faces the other midrange lists. So between Mosswood, Virtue of Persistence, these pieces are obvious. Are there any other pieces or synergies that give this list an advantage over that list?
I think one of the subtlest advantages that this deck has is the creature land Restless Cottage. The fact that Dimir doesn't have the ability to grind it out one for one and then rely on a land to take over the game in the late game is a huge issue for them. And the fact that we have this Blossoming Tortoise that's going to bring them back after they've died is also a huge piece of it, it turns out. Now, personally, again, I didn't believe the Tortoise was that much of a linchpin, but having a couple copies really does provide a lot of value, and it forces them to deal with it, or it's just going to keep dragging more creature lands out of your graveyard, putting them on the battlefield, and that's just another threat every turn, another threat every turn. And they're going to be cheap, they're going to be efficient, they're going to be 5/5s that give you food so you can race that life total down. It's a very efficient deck. It's got a lot of ways to push. And back a little bit ago, we would see Lily of the Veil out of Dimir, and it was a huge problem. Lord Skitter is really making that a nightmare for the Dimir players. Having the ability to just drop it, and if they don't kill it before combat damage, you have Lily immunity. And Mosswood Dread Knight cannot be understated in how hard it grinds. A lot of people are misplaying it right now. They're playing on 2 mana. They're just like, okay, we'll just adventure it, and then we'll play it like we want to get full value. Don't do that. Just play it as the 2-drop. Make them kill it, then adventure, then replay it. Like, it's a 2-drop, and then it's your 4-drop. And if they stutter step it between then and now, that's fine. You're fine with that. You're getting your card advantage. Dimir relies on being able to get that board position and snowball you, and Dread Knight does a great job of saying, you're not swinging with Gix, you're not swinging with Trespasser, you're not swinging with Underdog favorably. So if you want to get those draw triggers, it's going to be a bit of a problem.
Yeah, you definitely delay your opponent's attack. One deck that comes to mind is Esper Legends, another mono red. Both those decks have trouble with Golgari, and in particular, Restless Cottage with the food tokens really just gets their life gain going. So it can be tough to add enough damage to overcome that. Speaking of mono red, go ahead and talk to us about this list and its most recent performance.
Absolutely. So Mono Red took fourth and eighth place in the MTG Japan Open while coming in second place for the Pizza Box and grabbing quite a few other slots in the latest MTGO challenge. But that fails to tell the tale of this archetype's dominance lately. The list we're showcasing here is the fourth place list from Japan because I think it went a step further in the evolution of the archetype, pushing lower on the curve with Monstrous Rage after recognizing that while Urabrask's Forge represents inevitability against some control decks, it is a bit slow against Ramp, and Golgari has the built-in removal for it while also having the capability to race. I love where this build went, and I expect to see a ton of mono red as we push into our third weekend of Wilds and Standard. It's good, it's consistent, and it's such a thin line, usually in Standard, on whether mono red is like busted or terrible. And Godric, Charming Scoundrel, Monstrous Rage, these are all cards that really helped push it across that line. I don't think it's busted, but it's getting close.
Close to busted, a line that mono red is known for traversing all the time. Talk to us about some of these cards I see that are specifically are used to target specifically Sheldred as a major problem. We've seen it here's Warcrafting. There's Witchstalker's Frenzy now that I'm seeing in some decks, and also the Fealty card is the newest flavor of the Steel effect that red is known for. Which of these are better at dealing with Sheldred? How many copies of these do you want main versus sideboard?
So I think you can get away with a couple copies of Nahiri's Warcrafting in the main on any given list. And if you expect to see a ton of Golgari mid-range, you may want to go up to a third copy or consider that Witchstalker Frenzy as a one or two of. I think Nahiri's Warcrafting in the end is probably the strongest of the bunch, just because you don't have to have snowballed an advantage to play it and recover. Whereas Witchstalker Frenzy is at its premium when you are ahead and you're trying to, put the pedal to the metal, which Mono Red wants to do, admittedly. But it forces some very awkward positions where it's 4 mana unless you're swinging, and now maybe you have to make unfavorable attacks in order to get the mana cost low enough that you can kill the Shelly. And you see where this starts to be a bit more of an issue. Whereas Nahiri's Warcraft does a great job of saying for 3 mana, it'll kill just about anything, and later in the game you're also going to get a 2-for-1 card advantage off of it in many cases. So I think the Warcrafting is still the way to go for now. But we'll be watching to see if Witchstalker Frenzy, factors in as the meta keeps evolving. Now, Twisted Fealty, we mentioned briefly. That's really there for Domain. I don't think it's a good answer to Shelly because there are many decks. Basically, if you're going to Twisted Fealty something, that's the turn you win, or you're in a lot of trouble typically. And especially true with Shelly, because if you Twisted Fealty a Shelly, they take 4. They get it back, they untap, they've gained 2 of it back already. That's a problem. It doesn't really sort the problem for you. So that's why I think Twisted Fealty is a 1 or a 2 of in the sideboard. If you expect to see, Atraxas, if you expect to see Friction Flesh Gorgers, just those big dumb dirtles at the top of the curve, that's what it's there for. It's there to clean that up for you and let you just make them have to board out Atraxas against you.
Okay. Thank you for that explanation. There's certainly a lot of pieces that Mono Red can utilize right now, and those are among them. Talk to us about the next deck, Esper Legends. What recent changes?
Man, this deck is back with a vengeance, and it's not really a surprise to me that it's back now. Having seen the weekend results, I see why it did so well. And of all the Tier 1 archetypes, Esper Legends came out strongest from week 2. In the MTGO Challenge, it took 1st, 3rd, 7th, and 8th. In Japan, it snagged the trophy while pushing another copy into the top 8. And at the Pizza Box Open, it grabbed 2 slots in the top 8. And that's not even factoring the final MTGO Challenge. It won that as well. Make no mistake, with the addition of Virtue of Loyalty and Lord Skitter, this deck gained the missing pieces to make its comeback. Beforehand, we had to commit to 2 drops of Thalia and or Rona, and we had to play Skrelv, and we had to play that game. But now we can play this Catch-22 game with 7 instant speed 2 drops because of the Virtue of Loyalty and Fairy Mastermind, all of which scale. All of which are backed by Make Disappear to force opponents into either playing into counter magic or removal, or refusing to and then risk losing board positioning. Lord Skitter, on the other hand, can be cast and protected by Plaza of Heroes while helping scale Rafine's ability quickly and giving this deck some much-needed graveyard interaction. Golgari may call itself king, but it bows to the queen here.
Ooh, yeah. I can see why we may want to call this deck the Rafine mid-range lit Esper Rafine as opposed to Esper Legends. It's starting to shift away from that strictly Legends build with a lot of support cards. Now, speaking of that, I can envision a list with either the Virtue of Persistence for quick removal with life gain, or Virtue of Loyalty. This build obviously features loyalty. Which of these do you think are better for the deck, and when might you apply the other?
So I think in a vacuum, I like Virtue of Loyalty better because it's going to give you that catch-22 you want with Make Disappear, and it's also going to give you another threat to push with Rafine, a threat with Vigilance, mind you, which helps you get around opposing Wandering Emperors very quickly. And then at the top end of the curve, it gives you something to do when you hit that fifth land, and the ability to make your Denix, your Fairy Masterminds, your Wedding Announcement tokens all a lot bigger, your Lord Skitter tokens, your Wandering Emperor tokens. You can see where this is almost a mini tokens deck at sometimes, and Virtue of Loyalty plays beautifully into that. The one scenario where I think Virtue of Persistence merits more inclusion is if we see just an unending horde of mono red coming at us. Because if that's the case, I want to kill things early, gain life, and we are no longer the aggro trying to get under them. They are trying to get under us, and we need to contain them. But otherwise, I want Virtue of Loyalty hands down.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. I think both cards are pretty good, but yeah, loyalty edges out in most scenarios here.
Absolutely. And with that, we move into Tier 2. Max, take it away with Domain. Tell me what's going on here.
All right, domain. So there are two builds specifically that we've been looking at and analyzing. The only deck to go undefeated in the Swiss of the Pizza Box, plus performing a couple of top eights in the MTGO challenges this past weekend, led us to retain one of these two archetypes as a tier 2 archetype. Really, as quickly as it showed up on the scene, Invasion Domain, the one that favors Alara and the combo, is really not on the leaderboards at all. Now, while the combo was effective for giving Domain a game plan quicker than the traditional wait around and ramp up to 7, that build didn't have longevity in light of all the tempo, all the mid-range that's going on. So there's something fundamentally strong that I want to point out about the combination of Topiary Stomper and then curving into Invasion of Zendikar, getting you to 7, while on the way you're Leyline Binding, you're ossifying, Mardu Angeling with the Archangel of Wrath, your opponent's threats away. I just want to point out real quick, the addition of Virtue of Persistence does position this deck really well. It positions needed removal for the early game while creating yet another opportunity to go over the top of the other mid-range archetypes in the 7 slot.
So, Max, last week we featured Invasion Domain, and we said this is a great deck. It's hot. It's on the top. This week we're back to traditional ramp Domain. Which do you think is stronger?
So I personally think the more traditional domain build that we've been talking about for months really is the stronger, with just some new needed tools. And I think primarily because other players have started to figure out how to counteract the more combo-y version, with a little bit of hand hate, targeting the specific pieces of the combo that are problematic with the Cemetery Desecrator. So for this reason, I like the traditional domain just a bit better. It still gets the job done, even in the face of some tempo and some control.
Fair. Now, how good is Up the Beanstalk for this deck? We're starting to see more copies of that lately.
Yeah, this is a card I've had to think about quite a bit recently. Do I want this for the deck, or do I want something else slotted in? Because of course, there's so many things you can use, like the Celestis, Jodas Codex, or other little bits and tools that I've liked to use over time. But Up the Beanstalk presents an interesting case. I think you really want this card more in the sideboard, really as a way to hedge against sort of the control builds that you're seeing out there. You get to cycle once it hits, and then you just pile on after that. A lot of your cards are 5 or more CMC, including Leyline, so you're going to be drawing cards once it's already established on the board, and it's a hard thing to remove. So I do envision this as a piece for games 2 and 3.
It's not quite as broken without the cards from Modern Horizons like Solitude to just trigger it for free, but still pretty damn good.
Fair. Right. It's doing wonders in other formats, I hear. So yeah.
Now, last but not least here, I see all these builds. They're playing Tyrannix Rex. Is there a reason to not just play Hullbreaker Horror at a certain point when you're going up against control?
That's a really good question, and I think on this one, I'm gonna have to say really, there's not a great reason for not playing Hullbreaker Horror. You should probably play Hullbreaker Horror. Tyrannix Rex can just be removed sort of as it lands, and your opponent's going to be ready for that. I mean, the anti-creature metas, archetypes, defense are up and alarmed right now. Like, most decks are trying to hedge their bets against aggro, and trying to find ways to mitigate that. So in light of that, I think the flash creature that counter spells, removes permanents might have an edge over Tyrannix Rex.
That makes sense. All right, let's move it along. This is Orzhov midrange. Max, tell us all about it.
I like this deck because it's one of 3 decks I talk about as containing the famed white midrange shell. So when I refer to the shell, I'm referring to the curve out of 2 drops right there next to Wedding Announcement and then into Sarah Paragon. That defines this version of Orzhov. It's really halfway between a mid-range and a control build. You have cards like Farewell, Sunfall, Ossification, Lay Down Arms, and now The End that all but assure that your opponent's key creatures and pieces never have a chance to stay on the board. Now, while The End has mostly been a one-of in most lists, this deck boldly uses 2 copies, validating that decks like Golgari Aggro are catching a strong percentage of this deck's attention. With must-answer threats like Glissa, Sheldred in that deck, seeing play alongside other new must-answers like in Mono Red, Godric, or Blossoming Tortoise in either Sultai or Golgari, this card's value will only really rise. So, top end of the deck features some hardy Planeswalkers as well, to which I would really only might add the 7-drop Kaya, but that's for another discussion.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I love me some one copy of Kaya at the top of Orzhov midrange is some spice. But the major update in this list from Wilds is the inclusion of 2 copies of The End, and otherwise this is still about the same as it was last season. Do you agree with the inclusion of The End, or is the 4-drop slot just getting too clunky right now?
So while I just sang its praises,
Fair.
there might be another way. We're really jamming the 4-drop slot quite a bit here in this list and other lists that use that black base card. So there might be other alternatives. Other cards that I'm also thinking might add to the clunkiness of the deck would be the we just mentioned, Breach the Multiverse. So there might be another way. Virtue of Persistence is another way because it can act as both the 2-drop removal, gains you life against mono red, but also flips over to a very nice 7-drop, especially in a meta dominated by creature lists, decks like Domain included. So that might be an alternative.
Do you think that this list has become symbolic of the 4-drop slot in Standard becoming a little bit more difficult to navigate? You remember the end of last season, the 3-drop slot had just such a plethora of options. People were like, do we run Graveyard Trespasser? Do we play Lily? Do we play, Gix? How many of each? And that was Dimir. Do we have that issue in the 4-drop slot specifically for this archetype, but also in a macro picture when you look at the metagame and we see options like Paragon, Emperor, Sheoldred, The End, Archangel, Elspeth, Sorin? Like, there are a lot of good 4-drops right now. Is it becoming difficult to navigate?
I would say yes. And it's really started to have an effect on my deck building personally. It presents an interesting tension point in these meta tier lists between the low to the ground decks that aren't, clogging up the 4-drop slot, that are actually getting it done in the early game. Dimir Fae is a good example. And then the decks that do want to go that far and want to play more of a tempo game. So it's presented an interesting tension that I think you have to consider every time you sit down to build a new deck or a new archetype. That being said, I think we're starting to get away from using 4 copies of Sheldred, even in the list that can. And I think there's a good reason for that. People are starting to sideboard against it really well. And The End is part of that picture.
Fair. Now, speaking of Dimir Fae, let's talk a little bit about it. It's on our tier 2 list. Take it away, Max.
All right. So this particular version of the Dimir Fae list is a bit of a mixture between the full-on Dimir Fae list that we saw week 1 and Dimir midrange. Now, while they share many of the same cards, this version of the deck attempts more card advantage as a way of overcoming the opponent. By having so many instant speed responses, for example, we see the one Fading Hope in there, Spell Stutter, the Go for the Throats, the Cut Downs, 2 copies of Fairy Fencing. Having so many of these instant speed responses to the opponent's actions, we can essentially lock them out of the early and part of the mid game, while your early on flyers go in for the kill. So Trespasser in the sideboard is used to mitigate the decks that are loving the graveyard for right now. And late game Virtue of Persistence is what that has its mind and eye set on. Halo Forager seems to also be an excellent card in this list, especially if you can take advantage of the ETB effect every time to bring back some other kind of spell. Otherwise, it's a 3-power evasive body, and who doesn't love that? I just want to make one comment real quick. I do have a natural inclination to add Gix to this list, and I think it's because of all the early flyers and all the evasion. But something like a move like that might make it too much like Dimir midrange and dilute what the deck is trying to do.
So this build eschews Ego Drain, Fairy, Dream Thief, and it opts for more of a traditional Dimir aggro build that just happens to be Fey heavy. Do you think this is stronger than going with a full Dimir Fey build?
Um, Honestly, no. I think with this deck, you really have to pick between the two. And I made this mistake day one. I tried to build a mixture of the Dimir Fey with a Dimir midrange. And honestly, I just think you have to go one or the two. The Fae are really trying to do a different strategy, focus more on the early game and create value for yourself in the late game. Whereas mid range is really trying to tempo, keep your opponent at bay, create card advantage in another way, and then dominate in the late game. So I don't know. I don't know which one I like better, but I know you have to stick with either one.
Fair. And in this build, we saw 2 copies of the common quick study, that instant speed, 3 mana, draw 2 cards. Do you like it?
I do not, because I look at a card like that, a very simple of 3 mana draw 2 cards, and I think Planeswalkers can give me that advantage. Kaito's already in the list. We could just simply add more copies of that card, to be quite honest. So, yeah, I just think a little bit more creative deck building would be the answer there.
Okay, and last but not least, we saw that there was a 2-1 split with Shieldred and Talion the Kindly Lord. Do you agree with that 2-1 split? Does it make sense to you?
I think I'll apply my first answer here. I think you have to pick one, right? If you're going to go Sheldred, go 3 or 4, build out Dimir midrange. If you're going to go Talion, I'm not. First of all, I'm not sure I like the card over some of the other options, but if Talion's what you're going for, if you're trying to control the opponent a little bit here, get some card advantage, then I say you go with at least 2 Talion. One or the other, in my opinion, based on the build that you want.
Fair, fair. And that brings us to our next segment here. We have the Brewer's Corner. I'm going to kick things off here and start with a deck that was submitted to us by Lucas Castro. Thank you so much. I modified the hell out of the list, but the basic idea is still here. This is called Is It Spells? And the basics of this list is that it is trying to flip that Urabrask. I really liked it. It was really spicy. I don't know that this is going to be competitive at tier 1 level. I know that Lucas ran it into the top 600 of Mythic, though, his build. So perhaps I'm just dead wrong on this one. I love that we get to see Scalding Viper make an appearance finally. I saw this in the spoiler, and I thought this is going to be so interesting to try to build with, and I had not met anyone that had even really attempted it. But this deck does a great job of just bombarding your opponent with spells and saying, okay, we're going to get under. We're going to get under. We're just going to keep getting under them. And all of a sudden, we're going to take the game away. Like, it doesn't win with an overwhelming advantage most of the time. It just ekes out those wins. You get to play the Mercurial Spelldancer, which when you combine this and Vindictive Flamestoker with Experimental Augury, it's amazing. Yeah, like, they have to kill these cards because otherwise they get out of control really fast. It's a cool list. Try it out for yourself. Everything that we have is up on Moxfield, by the way. That is the change we have made this week. So there will be links in the description below. Check them out. All these lists will be available.
Hell yeah. I'm just going to say one thing about that deck. I bet they looked at Scalding Viper and were like, we're going to build a deck for Scalding Viper.
I mean, I love it because it's Scalding Viper, Vindictive Flamestoker, Mercurial Spelldancer, and Urabrask. All cards I wanted to play with for such a long time in Standard. And I hope that deck just continues to improve and get tuned. And, I hope it gets onto the tier list one of these days.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Me too. All right. Let's talk about this next one. We have a list I want to talk about. Boros Aggro.
Straight out of Japan. Here we go.
Let's go. I know. I love the Japanese meta. It's refreshing sometimes. So this list I like because I compare it to Azorius Soldiers, one of my personal favorite lists to play and pilot when I can. Just some notable pieces here that list tends to not have is Knight Errant of Eos, which can help you reload in the mid game very easily. I mean, this it's so easy to reload with this card, and it's fantastic. One of the new ones I want to try is Raging Battle Mouse with the celebration ability, giving your creatures +1/+1, and just keeping the attack going. But Resolute Reinforcements being in here is also another one of my favorites because you get to go wide with that strategy, and it's a great synergy with Knight Errant of Eos as well. But really the brand newness. Let's talk about Charming Scoundrel and let's talk about Emodane's Recruiter. These two cards are the newness, and Emodane's Recruiter. My God, I've been beaten by this card more than once in the past 2 weeks already. You just go wide, go wide, go wide, and then Emodane's Recruiter, and your opponent can't handle it.
It does a really excellent standard knockoff version of Reckless Bushwhacker, and I don't think a lot of people have
Yeah,
understood that because they look at the adventure side and they're like, like don't worry about the adventure side. You're only playing that if you have nothing else to do on turn 5. You're playing it to get the Reckless Bushwhacker effect and smack all your tokens through their teeth. It's fantastic for that.
yeah. And don't sleep on Charming Scoundrel plus Raging Battle Mouse or Godric or any of those celebration effects because we're starting to see a little bit more of that creep its way into the meta as well.
Yeah, of all the new mechanics, I think Celebration's the most undervalued one right now.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
with that in mind, let's move on to the next one. We've got Rock Reanimator. And I'm posting this up because I lost to it. I got rolled by it, and I was like, okay. I was playing Golgari mid range. I thought it was a mirror match until they played Cruelty of Gix, and I thought, oh shit. And then of
Uh-oh.
course the Atraxa came down to punish me. So this list, I'm gonna move it over slightly so people can see all of it. It's just basic Golgari, except you're going farther up the curve faster. You know, you get to rock out these Bramble Familiars, and I still can't wait to get these in paper so I can alter them for Guardians of the Galaxy value. But this is still it's a fantastic card. It's found a home in one of the domain lists, the invasion domain list, but now we're starting to see it come over and just be a solid ramp spell that pushes you into those turn 3 Shieldrids and gets you into those turn 4 Cruelty of Gixes, which this card still a house in the mirror. It's still a difficult thing to deal with. So I don't know. Deck's spicy. It still needs some work, but maybe one of you guys that's watching will be able to take a look at it and say, I know how to break that. And if so,
Yeah.
comment below and let us know.
Oh yeah. I like the addition of Bramble Familiar because of the adventure side of it as well. You know, you can
Mm.
use it as a 7 to mill yourself,
Oh,
and you
yeah.
only need one of those Atraxes in the deck. Cruelty of Gix, everybody forgets, but the third phase, you can steal your opponent's stuff as well.
Right? Right? You're going up against those other domain lists and they discard stuff early and you go, yoink, thank you.
All right, let's talk about a nightmare of a deck. Is it back? It haunts our dreams. It had such an impact once on the meta.
The PTSD of all decks.
Yes, 100%. So this tops out at 4. Unlike the Grixis decks of old, this just tops out at 4, which is great. Sheldred and Decadent Dragon making out the top end. Decadent Dragon is such a good piece. I know you've actually pointed out to me, Dark, that when I was building with this card, the expensive taste side of it, you don't get to spend any color mana to cast those spells, and that's very true. I'm guessing that they want you to cast the dragon side, get treasure tokens, and then cast those spells. But it's easy to point out if you're playing this in Grixis, you've already got 3 of the 5 colors of mana available to you. And they're 3 of the 5 that are getting the most play right now. There are lots of mono red, lots of domain, lots of Dimir, lots of Golgari, and you've got portions of that color wheel in those decks. So just a quick note: you definitely don't sleep on Decadent Dragon just because it doesn't allow you to spend any color mana.
Fair. Fair. And that'll bring us to our final segment, predictions for the upcoming week. Max, we have talked through 10 archetypes tonight. Are we missing anything going into week 3 of Wilds of Eldraine Standard?
Yeah, there's some lists that are notably absent from tiers 1 and 2. I challenged after week 1. I challenged Mono Black to come back and find a way into the top 2 tiers. It has not. And, to be fair, I think that's partially because nobody's really trying to build it right now. The deck is almost settled, although it does have some new pieces. It's almost settled. And so it's hard to justify going back to some of these older archetypes and seeing how well they do. But uh, that Mono Black and Selesnya Enchantress, I would say give a second look. Take a look at the new tech. There's a couple of straightforward builds of Selesnya Enchantress that while they're not top eighting anything, they're present in the events. And I just think if they're piloted well, if they're built out well, they have a chance. So let us know what deck you didn't see today that might come back in future weeks and an impression. Darth Rictus, what about you? Is there anything that you're anticipating happening this weekend?
Yeah, we saw a couple of Azorius Soldiers lists floating around the top eight, and I think we're starting to see people figure out how to build that, but we haven't
Mm-hmm.
seen a breakthrough yet. That said, the World Championships are coming up. We also haven't seen a coherent control strategy emerge in Standard, but when you see something like World Championships coming up, I expect to start seeing pros, especially those old hats that grew up and fell in love with old school mono blue control. They're going to come out of the woodworks and they're going to see if they can find a way to contain this meta. And given that the meta we've seen is Golgari, Mono Red, Esper, Domain, I think those four are not so diverse that you could not put together a control package that can handle it. So I don't know. I'm very curious to see what happens there. But in the meantime, don't forget to like, subscribe, share our channel with everyone you play Magic with. And make sure to tune in next week where we will dissect what happened at Worlds and what it means moving forward. Until
All
next time,
right.
untap, upkeep, resist.
Resist.